this is filtering the noise, which I think I promote as like better filtering for logging, but I'm mainly going to demonstrate filtering for traces. The principles are the same, I promise. We'll get there. We'll get there, folks. So let's talk about some level setting for considerations with, let me just turn off my HVAC here, sorry. Considerations with why we would want filtering at the OpenTelemetry Collector level. So just to review these like first principles. Everybody's seeing the slideshow. Okay, it's got the little green line around. That's why I assume you're all seeing this. Great. I'm going to assume that's great. Give me a negative emoji react if you're not seeing it, but otherwise we're good. So OpenTelemetry instrumentation, like any code level instrumentation, lets you send a lot of data rather easily. Some of that data is noisy, some of it is sensitive, and some of it is good, but needs tweaking. And once we've done the work to do instrumentation, especially instrumentation at the code level, when we're faced with a data collection problem, we would ideally want to fix that without requiring changes to our code base. So for most people who are working operationally, the thing is like, no, I cannot edit the code base, right? I don't know where these hooks are added. I don't want to message the product team and say, hey, turns out we're sending, people's social security numbers to our observability backend. Please go do this code commit tomorrow. That's not the workflow that makes sense for a lot of people. And we could talk all day and all night about how, well, you should have access to the code base. You should have a better connection. That's real DevOps, blah, blah, blah. Great points. But let's talk about like, okay, it's one thing when, oh my God, we're sending a ton of people's PII into observability when we shouldn't. What about the situation where it's like, hey, we're sending a little too much. Hey, the traces, they like, every step of a 500 step for loop, they're recording as a separate span and they shouldn't. Is that really something where you want to bother the product people about it and ask them to like edit the code? Like, for sure that's like, it'd be really nice if we had operational tools to do that. So there are let's take a look at this code where we can sort of imagine where we might have gone a little far here. So we had our developer, we said, hey, would you add some custom code points? Maybe they got excited about it. We did our little brown bag. They added a bunch of points. They added, hey, let's send the user ID as a value for this span. Let's send like how many roles are we doing? We'll use that. Or I think we decorate the child span with that. Yeah. And then let's also send their database key up as part of what we're sending. And that probably was going a little far, right? We're like, oh no, we're shipping this data like across the internet, and maybe we don't want to send their full database key. By the way, key is a somewhat overloaded term here, but let's just say like, this is not critical security issue, but it is like, hey, that's more than we really want to be sending around and showing to everybody in the back end. So there are a ton of, this is actually a diagram I drew for something else, but works fine here. There are a ton of points where we could say, hey, I don't want that database key completely as a complete string to be stored. And so going in and editing these code points, right, would be editing it at the service level, which might be in a whole lot of places. And then we might be able to, we very often have these collector to collector architectures. So what we're going to be talking about today is hitting it in one of these collector levels. And then the last and relatively common is doing it at the data store level. So this would be like, hey, maybe we're sending way too many spans on a single trace. Maybe that example of like, hey, we're sending 50 identical spans. Actually, this example, I don't have the code here. I'm not going to hop over to my IDE for this thing, but it is like, it's saying, hey, if you roll 7 dice, it's sending a span for every single dice roll. Like, be like, I don't know. I don't want all those sub spans, right? That might be an example where instead of trying to filter at the collector level, a pretty normal step would be like, oh, let's just go and edit the data store and say, hey, maybe older than this amount, we want to compress our traces in this way. That's a perfectly reasonable way to do it, depending on whether or not you have access to do that. I know with Chronosphere, generally you do. Certainly, if you like have a self-hosted data store for this, that should be very doable if you're using like Loki or Signas to do that. But we're going to talk about filtering at the collector level. Any questions about like why we're doing all this, why this matters, or is a tool that we would want to have?
Yes, why?
Yeah, so in general it's going to be sensitive data or it's going to be overfit data, are sort of the two main reasons. But then there's also just going to be this general sort of vibe, which is, hey, I'm looking at this trace here and I don't like what I see for some reason. So see, change the share here. I'm saying, hey, I'm looking at this trace and this isn't helpful for a reason I will explain, right? And that really can be anything. But when we work on the operation side, work on the SRE side, like here's an example of that where it's like, hey, you roll the dice 3 times. I don't need these little subspans. And once the request gets complex, it really starts to clog up the view. And it's not so much about like having an elegant view. That should be something that you can control on the UI side. But it's like, yeah, something's not looking right, and it's leading to distracting data. A perfect example is, hey, maybe you have a large request that is in fact asynchronous, but it's getting rolled into your database time. And so it's like, hey, that's very deceptive. And it's causing everybody to say, hey, the database is running really slowly, but that's not what's going on. And so that's pretty good time when we would say, hey, we don't want to go and actually edit application code or custom code calls. We want to do something at the collector level. So the reminder of like what can happen inside the collector, right, is like we have receivers and exporters, right, which do our transport standard communication, can send stuff out to statsd, can take stuff in from a million places. And then we have our processors in the middle. And we're going to talk about data scrubbing, data normalization, and a little bit about sampling. Batching, it's batching. That is what it is. But that is the concepts that we care about. Okay, so let's talk about filtering by attributes. So we have some attributes on this span that we say, hey, if we get these attributes, we really don't want to save this. So let's go ahead and demo that live. Let's do a new share and do it here. So here's my OpenTelemetry Collector configuration, and just stepping through what was necessary to add this. Hey, if a span has these attributes, I do not want to send it across. So in our application, right, we take a request attribute and we add it to that span right down here. We say, hey, the user for this is this request attribute user ID that we received. Obviously, with a real application, we should have the user ID from a million other places, but we picked it up here, and it turns out that a couple of our users are like our internal test users, right? And so, in fact, that's so consistent because it's like a automated testing suite, so we know they're always going to be named this. We say, hey, don't record any spans from these people because maybe they're testing stuff, maybe those spans get crazy long. They introduce a bunch of fuzzy, unnecessary data to our production environment. So we can add a processor section which starts with filter and then has whatever name we want it to have. So this is / we say, hey, we can call this dev users because that's descriptive. And then critically, and I think I have a slide about this too, we also add it to the pipeline down here, which is where I usually mess up. I usually go ahead and craft a very careful filter in the collector config. And let me give like one strike of zoom here. And then forget to add it to this thing. And this pipeline is read left to right. So, if you're doing things like transform filters or transform processors, which we'll talk about, you want to have just this in the correct order so that your transformations will have effect when you filter, and you generally want batch at the end. So if we save this config and go and restart our collector, come on, bud. Cool. And then we send in a couple of requests. So that was from David, and if I check my config, David's like an allowed user. But if I send one from Bob, so here's the service, right? It's the same dice roller that you've seen in the OpenTelemetry examples, right? It returns an array of dice rolls. Bob still gets his data because it's not like this is all observability side, so the application works exactly the same. But we should see that this span is dropped. We can hop over to our UI. And I have gone so far as to so this guy is just coming in as normal, and I believe has a user attached to it. Yeah, this is David. He's allowed. And this is like the Julia Child chopped onions, because no, I did not wait for this to show up in my observability backend. It would be there probably by now, but just so I didn't hit refresh and have it not show up. But then if we did send it in with with this guy who we didn't want, it will go ahead and drop that span. Now, in this case, that span did have child spans, so it still shows up as, hey, there was time spent here, but we did drop the span, so we know it existed, but we're dropping all data from it, which is, in this case, is what we wanted. What we wanted was, we wanted to say, hey, just this span is what doesn't matter. This is like we're doing like span level metrics for execution time, and so then we care about dropping that single span. Okay, I think I have like screenshots of that back in the presentation. We'll find out. A new share. Okay, so we want to go ahead and drop out the span. Yep, there's our nice little thing, and then our regular one rolls on just as we expect. Okay, so some stuff to remember about the filter processor. First of all, once it hits an attribute that'll filter, it's not going to hit the later conditions. So if there's an error on a later condition for some reason, it's not actually going to execute. And then any matching condition will work. So the config that you just saw, where it's like, hey, user equal to Bob, user equal to David, user equal to Alice, filter, right? That is going to work. It doesn't have to meet all those conditions. It just needs to meet one. And then if we drop out events, this is a confusion for some people depending on the model that they're using for monitoring. The span is going to stay there. So if we say, hey, the type is a span event, and we want to drop every single span event, we're still going to have that span. And then a metric works not the same way. If we drop data points from a metric until there are no data points, and the metric itself will not be reported, which makes sense. You wouldn't generally report, right? Like, hey, this data point, but nil metric. Or sorry, this metric, but nil data points was not something you would normally report. So yeah, this is my slide to remind myself and everyone else that you want to actually add these to the pipeline. Okay, so now let's talk about this problematic data here, where this is the key that we're getting through, which we really didn't want. So in this case, obviously we could write something that just said, hey, by name, drop this attribute. But we don't want to drop the attribute because we have this guest down in here, and that's useful to us. So we want to know if it's guest, admin, whatever else, whatever other role. That's useful information to us. We just want to drop the full key. And so for that, this got me for a minute. So you can have a filter that says, hey, it does it by match, and we'll take .star saying accept any attribute, but then it will not accept a full regex. And then I read this portion of the documentation, which is, hey, here's some alternative config, which could soon be deprecated. And that includes using regexes as your match type. And so I was like, wait, am I not supposed to be able to use regexes here? Am I supposed to just use this like relatively simple, like direct string matching? So you can, and my thing is write down this link, because something that I've had on my to-dos for a few weeks is to get this this doc a little better linked in to the other documentation, because a complete list of the OpenTelemetry transform language functions is like not super well linked into the like filter and transform processor. Don't actually write this down. I will share this. I'll drop it into the chat. You don't have to write down a whole link, but yeah, OpenTelemetry transform language those functions include a pattern-based replace, which we'll demonstrate in a minute here. So some notes on using this regex in a collector config. You want to double your escapes like this, which you can set as a style thing on regex 101 or wherever other regex test tool that you're using. And then you can use capture groups. They do work, but it will seem like they don't because you have to use this double $ thing to do it. So in this case, it's like, hey, whatever the actual, in this case, this person wants to change cube to K8s, and they want to change it to K8s dot. But they want the ID. They want to preserve the ID. So they're saying, hey, match this key, which is cube, and then some string of letters and numbers, and then go ahead and replace it with K8s, but then include what you matched in the parentheses. Apologies, that's regex review for you all, but regex is my home and my joy, so I always like to talk about it. But yeah, so you need to escape the $ for this capture group with a double $, and you have to use triple $ to use a single $. So sorry. This is just one of those things you have to note, because the beautiful thing about regex is that it always works except when it doesn't. And so yeah, these are just things you want to remember about your syntax. So yeah, so in this case, what we'd want is we want a transform processor, because we want to change our value, right, to just be _guest or just be some kind of escape and _guest. And so in this case, right, we say, okay, go and find it. And I've been a little bit greedy here, where I said, hey, look for this thing that's a whole bunch of numbers, more than one number for this. Like, don't just take anything that is a user DB key, and then go ahead and overwrite the ID with replacement ID, and then your whatever group you first matched. So then you'll get something like this, replacement ID _guest. I have a version of this trace in the Signals dashboard, but take my word on it, this works. So transfer processors, really effective way. You can grab some other values if you need to. You can chain them together, but the big thing is just to do like really smart collapse of cardinality and collapse of PII. Really, really nice tool to do that. So what can't you do with collector processors? You know, we've seen this beautifully impressive demo here of the stuff we can do. A lot. There's a lot that you cannot do with collector processors. So here I would say is probably the big ones. The big ones is you cannot change the relationships that spans have with the processor. You cannot just say, hey, you go be part of this trace now, nor can you create a parent-child relationship like, oh, you actually were kicked off and we're inside this other one, and I'm going to know that from like your naming convention, and then I'm going to stick you on to this other one. So you can do filtering and transformation, and you can touch trace ID. I haven't experimented with this extensively, but apparently it is not possible to like push something into a trace after the fact. This makes some sense because of the way that like sampling and other kind of working with traces happens. There's like some computer science reasons why this is like not a trivial thing at all, would not be a trivial thing at all to implement, but you want to be aware of it. And I learned this for the first time. It's sort of, you know, it's hard to notice an absence. Sometimes you feel like, oh yeah, I'm fully in control of this, I can do whatever I want. But then Hazel's great talk for this same user group clued me into like, hey, this is a limitation here. And I haven't like tried to hack it to every degree, but it's definitely, yeah, there's no built-in call to say, hey, like add child relationship. Not at all. You also can't drop a whole trace. So you notice that I had this example where it's like, hey, don't look, the span is gone, no worries. But you would sort of like to say, hey, I can go in and say, hey, this span looks bad, let me go ahead and just lose this trace. And that is quite a new kettle of fish called tail-based sampling, right? Where you're looking at all of the traces that you receive, and you're saying, hey, I only want these ones to come through based on some information about the trace. So this is the dichotomy between head and tail based sampling. Head based sampling is right before trace even starts, you decide if you're going to run it or not, maybe based on like the tiniest amount of data, like what route it's in, or whatever like request information you have. But otherwise, basically it's just, I want to say the word, I know it's the wrong word, is skeuomorphic. Skeuomorphic has a completely different meaning, but you're doing probabilistic sampling in that case. With tail-based sampling, this thing that we all want, whether or not we can have it, is you're saying, hey, now that I'm looking at the trace, I decide that you're interesting and want to send you on. Tail-based sampling has a bunch of promise for the efficiency that it's going to add to your system and only sending interesting traces. Traces are relatively expensive to transmit, store, process. So it's very promising, but it has its own caveats to make work. So this is we did most of the presentation. I did not pause for questions a bunch of times, but do we have questions about that, about head and tail based sampling and why that is not supported in the simple filter transform system? Love it. I have to go give this same talk, not this same talk, but a version of this talk to CGL next week, I think. And so thank you so much for joining me on this journey, because there's not a ton out there about these pieces. I mean, admittedly, like the transform processors in alpha, so I totally get it why there wouldn't be a ton out there about it. But yeah, I'm glad we're getting to talk about it now. So feel free to make comments or drop in the chat if you have other questions. There are 29 things in the chat, and I have not been looking at the chat at all. Sorry.
Most of it is our bullshit, but Paige is asking, how do you recommend testing config changes before shipping them to prod or monitoring to know if you messed up a filtering rule?
Yeah, really good question. So I'm gonna hit back a million times. Sorry about that. I do think that a really good way to do kind of experimental stuff where you're saying, hey, I want to do a kind of a multi-level change to what we're doing. I want to do a complex transform. The two things are, one is to just have a test version, have some piece of your observability inside your test harness. And so have your local version of a collector or somewhere else to test it. The other is to this collector to collector architecture is extremely useful here. So you can do like a canary deploy to say, I'm just going to send it out to this one sub piece instead of just our master collector architecture. And then the third is to do some further limitations, because you can chain together an and here. So you can and then you can use resource values. So you can say, hey, only do this to this service name. So that's super useful for doing this. I didn't show that piece. I didn't do that here, but you can say, hey, I want this to have X service name and also check for this span value and then drop the span. So you can start it out as being more limited before it's spread out to everybody else. Really good question. Is a collector restart always required to pick up new config? Great question from a long time ago. I would get kicked off of Twitch so fast because I'm not looking at chat. Ugh. Embarrassing. I used to know the answer to that, Page, and now I do not. I seem to recall that there was some issue that I read about the feasibility of some kind of hot reloading of config, but essentially, yes, you have to do a collector restart, certainly in your like little test bed environment. Yeah, there's also not like the collector has relatively limited like remote abilities to pick up config. So yeah. But yeah, that's something maybe one of the Honeycomb people will know something about, has fiddled with a bit, and I can check with the rest of Signal's team as well. Okay, so we dropped this replacement ID. We did that, talk about what we can and can't do. And yeah, there is a tail sampling processor out there. It has its limitations, but you want to explore that separately as its own processor and its own service for dropping entire traces. Okay, so words of caution with metric transformations. So conversion between data types isn't supported by the metrics model, but you can do it with a transformer, but don't do it, but you can do it, but don't do it. It's exceedingly easy to create meaningless metrics, right? To like doing things like creating averages from max values, right? Which you shouldn't do. Yeah, I would say very much like you're in the realm of, creating statistical transformations just with like Excel equations at that point. So you are in danger certainly of messing up what you're doing and getting stuff that looks okay, but it's in fact extremely bad signal. What have I seen? I've seen like somebody processing in, creating a new average with a single new value. So they have an average of the last 10 values and they get a single new value and they say, okay, cool, I can just add that one to the average, which was not quite right. And so, yeah, things like that are worth a concern. So, yeah, a bunch of the transformations between measurement types are one directional. And so you should not use the transform to try to go back and or to try to move between these lanes because you will end up with bad data that is still data that still looks like data and will still chart like data. So that's a concern. Very similar to going in and doing like just queries directly into your data store to edit your data, right? Like you want to be exceedingly careful with that because of course there is always the possibility of destroying the information that you have. Slide 2 of cautions about metric transformations. So you can change the labels on metric and traces. So you can cause yourself data store problems by giving things the same names as two metrics or two time series. You give the same name, attributes, and scope. And I tried to break Signa's, the like ClickHouse data store, doing this because I was very excited to see something break, but I couldn't quite do it. But presumably you can get to the point where you're having, dashboards not load or other queries not working because you have double results when there should be unique values in a column. So a more common outcome of that will be orphan values, will be spans that are not part of any trace and traces that are not connected to any service. Oh yeah, Rin, I'll put it. We'll put it in the CNCF collector channel. I'll ask it in the CNCF collector channel. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually search the CNCF collector channel because it's interesting. The question was, do you have to do a collector restart always to get to pick up new collector config? I think the answer is yes, but
yes.
Yeah, and I thought there was an issue about it. There was a talk about exploring some support for that, but I'm certain that by default right now the answer is no. That was the end of the slideshow, folks, which really just crept right up on me. Do we want we saw live demo stuff? Oh yeah, let's go do one last live demo thing. That's right. That's what I wanted to do. New share. Okay. So man, there was totally some. Oh, right. We had the situation where we are getting way too many components. This thing like roll it sends you back an array of rolled dice. And we had a situation where when we send in a request to say like, hey, roll 41 dice for me, we get back this nice array very, very quickly. But the problem is that when we go and look at the traces for these guys, they just have a ton of these individual single dice rolls, which in this version, right, is not really a problem, right? Your trace dashboard should be able to just hide those a whole bunch of nested rolls. But for whatever reason, in our example, we're saying, hey, this is an issue. We have hundreds of these, we have thousands of these. We know they're all identical. They always take the same amount of time. We want to get these out of here. This is an older trace that didn't have 40, but just had 6, but you get the point. And so what we want to do is we want to say, hey, I want to drop these spans, these roll one spans, but some helpful and also sabotage focused developer has named each of the spans uniquely. So we can't just say, hey, go ahead and drop any span that has this name, because it includes like, this is the counter on that roll. So that is something that we want to handle. We don't need a regex for this. We just need the match tool. So if we go back into our IDE, I'll start typing the command, but I want to actually show this. So if we go back into our IDE, go back into our config, we can say, hey, span, if you have a match on your name that is roll ones followed by anything, let's go ahead and drop that span. And if we save this and then we restart our collector, our app's been running this whole time. So now asking for 41 dice rolls. It says for 40. Who likes using a prime number? I certainly don't. While I politely wait for a second for these traces to hit my local collector, get to the batch moment, which is like every 5 minutes on my thing, and then get sent off to the back end. Do we have other questions about this stuff? About I didn't mention it, but you can you have the same filter functions available on metrics and logs. So we demoed this all with spans, but it is totally doable with metrics and logs by the same principles. But yeah, other questions, feel free to drop them in chat or come off mute. I promise I am watching the chat now. No worries. Okay. So yeah, now let me go ahead and start sharing this. This is just our last 5 minutes of requests. And so we were just looking at a previous one where it was like, hey, we have way too many of these. Now, if we go ahead and sort this and look at our most recent traces, we should, sure enough, be able to see. I also gave it the name that's like, hey, don't drop this name. So we're dropping two things here, but our actual roll dice is happening. It drops the routing span because again it has this name it doesn't like, and then it also drops the sub like individual roll once spans. Okay, folks, that's been my stuff. Man, 38 minutes. Wow. Usually when I'm doing something for like the first or second time, I like time it out, talk it all through. I'm like 45 minutes. And then when I actually get in front of people, 11 minutes. Just zipping. But this one, I guess there's a lot to say about this. Final stuff. The functions are all out, are all fully supported. The transform processor is still in alpha, and you're going to need your own build of the collector to make sure you include it, which I mean you need to do for other collector contrib stuff. So that's pretty standard, but just be aware of it. You wouldn't want to base like your whole DIY observability stuff on transform processors. Like do some work ahead of time to like get your stuff labeled right, and don't be like completely reliant on it because it is an alpha. It is going to shift a little bit, and there are some standards conversations happening, but it's definitely worth doing for stuff like this, for like, hey, you have this filtering or transformation task and you don't want to bother your product team. Okay, folks, that's been my time. I don't know, Adrian, if you want to give like final stuff. While you're filtering out these spans not to be shipped to Cygnus, can you route them to something like S3? Oh, that's an interesting question. So not with this set of tooling. You cannot use like a filter processor to say now go to a different exporter lane. But you certainly can do that with with your import tools, right? So with your components where you're taking in data, you can obviously say on your receivers, oops, don't do that. You can say on your receivers like, hey, I want to pick up these values and send them to this other endpoint. Yeah, and then go into a separate pipeline. Filter is like drop. Filter is like drop or remove data. It's not route this data to another endpoint. Great question. Pretty sure you can do that routing by span name, but also should you do that? That's a good question. That's a really good. I should write something about that. I'll share. That's really good. I'm gonna like look at a future blog post about that. That's a really good question.
Any other questions for Nika?
Rin says in chat, yeah, there are a lot of tools out there that help with managing your pipeline, including like especially, we got four observability team people here who can talk a lot about how like there are times when I think all of us want to be like, hey, we're your one-stop shop to look at your data, but there's going to be reasons that you're sending it to multiple places. Examples, of course, be like sending stuff to CloudWatch, but also sending it to a New Relic dashboard, sending stuff to S3 as like, hey, we're going to cold storage this, but we want to have it. Obviously, classically logs, right? Sending them to multiple places, to one place where the retention is 10 days and another place where the retention is 10 years. So yeah, that's going to make a ton of sense. So yeah, there's something written about that. Written, maybe I'll hit you up for like we'll do like a partner post or something on it, because it's an interesting question and not one where there's a ton written about it.
Sure, yeah, that sounds good. Most of the pipeline stuff I've seen is from pipeline companies.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to break it down from a perspective of folks who are more neutral towards which pipeline you choose.
Yeah. Really good page is like Page says, in the last webinar I did, they asked us how many observability tools they had, and a significant portion of the group said 5+. I think if we were being honest, everyone's going to say at least 2, right? No, at least 3. They say, hey, I have an observability tool, which is the thing called observability that says observability on its SEO filing. Then I have some kind of logging tool, and then I have a debugging tool that I use, right? I have my ClickOps tool that I use to go in and look at what the heck's going on. And so that's at least 3, right? If not, then okay, well now what do you use as like a pinger or other synthetic metrics, right? That can so yeah, now we're at 5, right? With just what I would say, like, oh, like you list all 5, you're like, oh yeah, that's normal. That's normal. I need all this. It's like me looking in my purse. I'm like, I need to get some stuff out of here. They're like, no, I need all of this. I need 2 batteries for my phone. Can't get rid of these. Oh man, great chat. Thank you so much. And again, big shout out to Rin. You missed it right at the start, Rin. I was like really thanking you for doing the last minute promo. I will be giving a similar but not identical version of this talk, because we can all admit there were parts that dragged. I'll be a similar version of this talk at CGL next week. And then also we'll be doing it at another conference whose name escapes me in January. Will to follow. Code Smash, which is in January or something. I'm going to be giving the same talk. And also I'll be at KubeCon. And if you want to come say hi at KubeCon, come say hi. And also try Signos. And also thank you.
Thank you so much, Nika, for joining us today. And thank you everyone who was able to make it. This was actually a really good turnout for OTel in practice. So thank you for taking the time. Also, if you know anyone who wanted to attend but couldn't make it, let them know that we will be posting a recording of this on the OpenTelemetry YouTube channel. The handle is OTel-official. If you haven't subscribed yet, we've got a bunch of previous videos from OTel in practice, OTel Q&A, and even some of our end user discussion groups. So definitely check it out.
Please check out the Hazel weekly one from
Yes.
6 weeks ago now. Was really, really key stuff. So that's really worth. So if you want a reason to go check it out, that's a really good one.
Yeah, it's next level. It's very, very good content. And we've got an OTel Q&A coming up on November the 16th with Jennifer Moore, where she talks about her experiences with OTel implementation at one of her previous companies. So that will be also a really great session to look forward to. It'll be in this time slot, same time slot. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything else they want to share? Reese, Rin?
Nope, just a huge thank you to Nika.
Yeah, this was awesome.